Hey, thanks for checking out some of our mental health resources for our series Weeds. This has just been an honest look at mental health. And we've been honest in looking at some of the challenges that a lot of us go through at one time or another. Now this week is one of the most tender and most challenging topics that we're going to address, and it's self-harm and suicide. Now, if you're in crisis, let me give you this number to call right away. 988 is the National Suicide and Crisis Hotline. A phone call to connect you with a trained person who can help. That's what we want. We also want you to know that you're not alone. Those needing help, please know that suicide is not the answer that you think it is. Those of you who have lost a loved one to suicide, please know it's not your fault. For those of you wanting to help a friend or a loved one, thank you. We do have a sacred responsibility to share one another's burdens. Now, I know we can't address everything in a 30-minute message, and so that's why we've created this resource page to give additional help and hope. We have these focused, brief interviews with professional counselors each week. We have some other resources on this page as well. Thankfully, I have Carl Lloyd here, Dr. Carl Lloyd here. Thank you for being here.
You bet.
And I'm super excited to have also Amy Maas here as well.
Thank you.
Your brother, I know, committed suicide. You're going to share part of his story, and so I thank you for doing that as well. So let me ask this first of all. Dr. Carl, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are, your practice, your specialties, and then I'll ask you some questions.
Yeah, I was raised on a working farm in Michigan and ended up joining the Navy at 17, and then the Lord led me out to Oregon, where I met my wife Connie of 50 years. And we have 4 adopted children and 12 grandkids and 1 great-grandson. I've been in practice for 50 years. I do 1 day a week pro bono, and then I work for Life Stance Health in Tualatin.
Great. Well, thank you for doing that, and thank you for sharing here and being here. And Amy, I especially want to also thank you for being here and being willing to share part of your story and your family's story. So maybe if you can briefly tell us a little bit about Brian's story and your story and how that intersects, and that'll be great.
Well, my brother was my biggest hero. I always wanted to be around him when I was little. People often thought we were twins because we were about the same height, but he was actually 2 years older than me. So in our early childhood, things were okay, but as we got to when we started growing up and that kind of stuff, things changed. There were some unfortunate circumstances in our family, abuse related. And Brian took it really hard. He was one of those guys that on the outside had this tough shell, but really underneath he was just a big teddy bear. And so he wore his emotions on his sleeve. He always felt like he was having to prove himself and was always wanting the recognition of our parents, and he never really got that. And so when he was 17, he decided to early enlist in the Marine Corps. My parents weren't very happy about that. Sure. But he early enlisted and fought in Desert Storm. He was one of the youngest Marines during Desert Storm. While he was over there, his commander basically got hit with shrapnel. And so my brother did life-saving services for him and saved his life. And so then my brother became the kind of the commander of their LAV. And so he spent quite a bit of time over there and saw some really ugly stuff. And so between the baggage of our childhood and the baggage that he came away from with the military, when he came back, he was never the same person. He did go to the VA and got some counseling and got on some medication, and he was actually doing pretty well at that point. But like a lot of people who take medications or go through counseling, when they start feeling good, they don't think that they need to keep taking the medications and that kind of stuff. And so he stopped taking his medication and unfortunately turned to smoking marijuana. And so he became, he was really angry, really sullen, that kind of stuff. And so he pushed a lot of people away, me included. He had a genius IQ. And so he always struggled with the faith kind of thing. How can God allow all this hurt and pain.
Sure.
And so he just really struggled with that. He was baptized and he did commit himself to Christ. But that was a huge struggle for him. And since I was a believer and devoted faithfully, he would always question me, and we'd get in these big arguments because he just, with his high IQ, just, wanted all the answers to his questions, and he couldn't get them. And so he continued to kind of progressively go downhill, deteriorate. And then on May 24th, 2017, he ended up killing himself.
I'm so sorry. How old was he at that point?
44.
44.
Yep.
Well, thank you for sharing his story and your story. Can you share a little bit maybe about how you guys processed everything initially? I mean, the shock and how you and your family dealt with all this?
Well, I got a call that evening by my mother. I got 2 calls back to back, and I thought it was really strange because she never did that. So I ended up making a phone call, and she was crying, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, something happened to my father. And she's, said to me, Brian's dead. He committed suicide. And at first, it was just like went in one ear and out the other. My brain just couldn't comprehend it. And then she repeated herself a couple more times. And then I was just kind of argumentative with her, like, no, he wouldn't have done that. That's not something he did. And then about the 4th time, it really hit me, and I was just like kind of in that panic mode. And I knew that I needed to get in my car, and I needed to go up there, particularly to support my parents, but also at the time, my niece was 15 years old. And so I wanted to go up there and provide support. But as I was driving up there, I was totally on autopilot. And I was just thinking, I gotta get up there, show my support, that kind of thing. But I also wanted to say goodbye to him. Mm-hmm. And so I was driving like a maniac to get there. And unfortunately, I didn't make it in time to say goodbye. And so that was a really big struggle for me. Mm-hmm. And then that first week, my family was just kind of in shock. My parents didn't want people coming over. They didn't want to talk about it. Sure. And that was difficult for me because I process things differently. I'm more open than that. But my parents didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to see family members or friends and that kind of stuff. And so that just kind of continued.
Okay.
And so I put everybody's grief before my own. And I did it for months and months on end. His widow had his ashes and would never communicate as to what she was going to do with those. And so it became quite contentious between all of us. What are you going to do? That kind of thing. And I had reached a point in my own grief, because I had stuffed it so hard, that I asked Carl if he would go up to Willamette National Cemetery, where my uncle is buried at, and if we could have kind of like a little memorial service for Brian. And it was very important to me that he be recognized for his service to the country and get validated for that. We spent probably an hour and a half up there, and it just gave me the time just to talk to Brian. And, I was everything from angry to funny things we did as kids to sobbing, and it was just this cycle. But it helped me to get a lot of that grief out, a lot of those ugly emotions that I was carrying around, and really set me on the healing process. So I'm very thankful to Carl and Connie, his wife, that I got that opportunity to do that.
Well, thank you for sharing that part. It's been 6-7 years now.
Yeah.
Can you share maybe what's been helpful for you and for your family, and maybe also what's been not so helpful?
Well, as far as my family goes, it really fractured our family. So there are people like my parents don't talk to their grandkids don't talk to parents, my nieces don't talk to me, and it's just very fractured. I don't think that there's necessarily anything that would have helped my family. It's just part of the family dynamics and who they are as people. Specifically for me, was just being able to talk about it, to keep Brian's story out there. I feel a great need to keep his memory alive, and I feel a great responsibility for that. Everybody just wants to think about that, that 5-minute decision that he made. And it's like his life was so much more important than that. He was a father, he was a brother, he was a husband, he was a former Marine. And so he was much more than just that 5-minute decision. Right. So just, different people allowing me to talk about it without judging it. It just, and talking about my grief, I think there's this misnomer that grief is like this 10-step kind of thing, and you're going to start at step 1, and then you're going to move to step 2, and eventually you're going to end up in hope and joy. And it's like, that's not what happens. There's some days where you're just very hopeful. I look at pictures of my brother and I'm just like, yeah, you're the best. And then there's other days where I've moved back down the grief cycle and I'm very sad. I listen to a song and I think about him and I start crying. Right. And part of it is just letting go for yourself, because there's a lot of, you feel a lot of shame. You feel a lot of guilt. What could I have done? What could I have said? That kind of thing. And being reassured by people that there was really nothing you could do. It was a choice that they made, and if you could have stopped it, great, but you couldn't. As far as what didn't help, the biggest thing for me was I had Christian friends in my life who, from the very get-go, said to me he went to hell. And that's not biblical. It's not what I believe. It's not part of my faith walk. But that was very hard. I had these close friends who I thought I could rely on, and when you're being told that your loved one is in hell because of this one sin, it's very hard to take. It just adds to that grief. So that was probably the biggest thing. And then just bringing up negative stuff about my brother. My brother wasn't perfect. I'm not perfect. None of us are perfect. But would bring up stuff about his past and past choices. And, well, if he wasn't smoking marijuana, then he wouldn't have killed himself. And it was like, we don't need to be discussing that kind of stuff. I just want to bring notice to my brother. I want to tell you why I love my brother. I want to tell you why he was a good person, that kind of thing. But I think Christians, too often, there's a fear. If I go and ask you something about it, either one, I'm going to offend you, or the second is that somehow that's going to trigger something in you, and that's going to be a bad thing. And so I'm not going to say anything at all. I'm just going to back off and not say it. And so you just feel very alone, because you expect that the closest people in your life are going to come and talk to you, and they're so frightened that they just don't do it. And that's really hard. And then it's really hard, it has been 6 years for me, but it feels like yesterday. And so everybody else has moved on. I've moved on in some ways. But it's always there. Right. Time doesn't heal all wounds. I'm always going to have that wound. Part of me is always going to be angry about it. I had somebody say to me, well, when are you going to stop being angry? And I said, stop being angry. I'm going to be angry about for the rest of my life, because it didn't need to happen. And so that's probably the hardest part.
Wow, I just appreciate your transparency and your willingness to share. So, Dr. Carl, you've been with Amy through part of this journey, and so maybe can you share a little bit maybe about Brian, and what you know, and then maybe a little bit broader, with the whole idea about self-harm and suicide?
Yeah, I regret personally not having known him. Would have loved to have gotten connected and being able to share with him clinically and move in that direction, but that wasn't it. It was a real honor to facilitate the National Cemetery Memorial, which was good. Veterans of Foreign Wars showed up with a burial team and 21 gun salute and all of that, those kinds of things. Presented Amy with an American flag, and that was really great. The things that she's talking about, Christian or not, we do recoil. We don't really know what to say, so we don't say anything. And sometimes it's better to say something, or at least say, I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you. Hugs and tears are good.
Yeah, sometimes I say that our tears are actually miniature messengers that speak for our crippled words.
Right, that's great. Another thing I'd really want people to understand about suicide is that we use a reverse bell curve going down, and when people start getting depressed, they get so far and they get really depressed. When they're really depressed, they're not complete suicide. They don't have the energy to do it. They're too fatigued, whatever. But when they start feeling better, that's when they complete suicide, because they have the energy and focus to pull it off. So one of the things that I think is really clinically important is for people to be aware of what's going on in their loved ones' lives, and be ears to hear, and be supportive as much as we can, and giving somebody the space to be able to share their heart and express their anger and the resentment and some of the bitterness that comes with that, but also share the joy and rejoicing over the life that was lived. Because Brian's time in the Marines was one chapter in his whole book, and I would argue that the suicide is a very brief chapter in the whole book. Right. Looking at the whole book is really the powerful part of grieving and being able to put things together.
I think that Amy articulated so well this idea about grief, that sometimes we expect everybody to grieve the same way, and for some time it goes way too slow, for others it goes way too fast. Can you speak a little bit about grief, especially in regards to suicide?
Yeah. Most people in our culture today are aware of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work on death and dying. She was an oncology physician and wrote about 5-6 stages that we go through. But she wrote specifically for people dying with cancer. There was a colleague of hers at the same time, different hospital, Granger Westberg, who wrote a very small book. It's about 60 pages, and it's a real small volume called Good Grief. And in that, he goes through 20 phases that the survivors go through. I always try to get people to either buy a copy. It was $5.
What's the name of the book again?
Good Grief.
Okay, we'll try to put that
Granger
on.
Westberg.
Okay, great.
He was a pastor and a chaplain in hospital, and that's where he pulled all of the information to put these things together. So where Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote for people dying with the disease, Granger wrote for the survivors and what they're going to go through, and real powerful. And I think what Amy was saying earlier, I would concur 1,000% with, in the sense that we don't want to look at these stages. They're not 10 stages to nirvana or heaven. There are a lot of reasons why we do recycle and come back. I think one of the difficulties for tragic deaths, if there's not such a thing as an untragic death, but suicide, is that it's like a sneaker wave at the coast, so that you can be walking along and a wave will come up and smack you right inside the leg and break your leg, or throw logs and stuff at you. And it's like that. We progress, and then we have something just come out of the blue, smacks us down. And that's where, if we learn certain cognitive and certain behavioral skills, we can kind of modify and work with those kinds of experiences.
Okay. Well, again, thank you both for being here. I'd like to ask maybe one question to kind of wrap it up from both of you. What else would you say to someone who's experiencing this firsthand like you have, or if you're counseling somebody that has gone through this? What are some things that we could do, or what was one last piece of advice that you would give for us?
There's several pieces I would give. but being somebody who's struggled with it myself, is
Struggled with what?
suicide, thoughts of suicide.
Okay, thank you.
Depression, anxiety. We tend to, when we're anxious or we're depressed, we're thinking about something that's going to happen in the future. And those things usually never materialize. Right. But we get into our head for whatever reason, we start looping, tomorrow's, I got an F on my paper, especially for young kids, I got an F on my paper. How am I going to tell mom and dad? They're going to be disappointed, and that kind of stuff. And so then they start thinking, well, how can they deal with this? What should I do? That kind of that future talk, which never really happens. Then there's the other hand where there's people who are grieving something in the past, childhood trauma, whatever. And I think people who struggle with suicide, what I would say to them is stay in the present, stay where you're at, lean towards God, feel free to talk to somebody. We have this thing in our society, our culture, where mental health is, we perceive it as somebody's choosing that. You're choosing to be depressed. You're choosing to be anxious. We don't do that with people who have physical ailments. And so we really need to get to this point in life and with church where we just accept it. It's brain-based. It is what it is. You can ask people if they're going to commit suicide. That's not going to push them to suicide. But just staying in the moment and knowing that it's one day, it's one time. If you have to take it 1 minute, 15 minutes, 2 hours, if that's how you have to make it through the day, that's totally normal and it's totally fine. But really speaking to people and saying it's okay to say you're not okay.
Thank you, Amy. I appreciate that. Carl, any last thoughts?
Yeah, part of the reality is, and we've talked about this earlier, the elephant in the room is the theology of eternal death or Hades or hell for those who complete suicide. And I always try to reference people back to Martin Luther, one of the great reformers, who actually was a Catholic priest, and he was trying to reform theology within the church. And he came across a young kid that was like 9 or 10 who completed suicide, some horrible situations in his family and the community. And the local priest refused to give him last rites and refused to bury him in the graveyard at the church. And his parents were just overwhelmed with grief. And Luther heard about it and went, actually confronted that priest in the pulpit on a Sunday, and almost came to fist-to-cuff blows. Luther wasn't somebody to mess with, for sure. So he gave the child last rites and buried him in the church's graveyard. So those kind of things are real important. So I think for all of us dealing with a lot of myths that we have picked up and bad theology that we've heard about and those kind of things is there. Part of the reality is we all need someone to talk to and talk with and share what's really going on in our own hearts and be accepted for that. Right. So one of the things the church can always do is be accepting, be empathetic, listen deeply and clearly to really what's going on. And if you don't know what to say, just go up and say, I don't know what to say. Right. Give a hug and, be in silence. Sometimes being in silence is a perfect resolve and a good therapeutic intervention. Yeah. People just sit with where they're at. But accept that and be content with the reality that our loved one is gone from this life, but there's all kinds of ways that we do memorialize others, and Amy certainly has photos and those kind of things, and being able to hang on to those really important memories that are critical.
Well, again, thank you guys. I appreciate your willingness to share, and I know it's painful, but I appreciate it. So we'll encourage some other people as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.